Welcome. This is Aki Anastasiou here. Welcome to the My Broadband Cloud Conference. And yes, you've guessed, it's still COVID-19, and boy, has it changed the world. This is why this particular conference is done virtually, and it's really great that you're joining us, having these incisive conversations and very important conversations with the thought leaders in the market when it comes to the cloud and how the cloud is impacting. And then can you just imagine if the cloud wasn't to its mature status where it is right now, what the world would be right now? There certainly would be no business continuity. So a great pleasure to welcome Abdul Moosa, who's the Chief Technology Officer for a very interesting company that was formerly known as Fujitsu. And you're now known, and you guys have got a very interesting name because it's written in an interesting way. It's co-create, right? How would you pronounce that and how would you spell it? Is that right, Abdul?
That is correct, Aki, and firstly, thank you for having me. I think it's quite an interesting topic. If you think about digitization and you think about where the industry is moving to, the concept of collaboration and co-creation is one that pops up quite often.
Right.
Because it's not like the old days where most entities developed a solution and they had all the answers to all the business problems.
Yes.
And where we find ourselves today, which is in a very complex world of many things, collaboration and co-creation are two words that come to mind. And where the company's name originated from was, how do we undertake a journey collectively with an ecosystem that's not only ourselves as co-create and previously known as Fujitsu, but the entire community to drive a specific outcome. Strangely enough, we played with a few concepts in terms of the names, and eventually we came up with a very catchy name with the number 8 at the end.
I love it.
Instead of spelling the word co-create.
Well, I absolutely love it, and 10 out of 10 to your creative department, whoever came up with it. I think it's a brilliant, brilliant name. And thank you for joining us. And yeah, you mentioned the importance of the cloud, and we're hearing about private clouds, we're hearing about public clouds, we're hearing about hybrid clouds, but everyone is talking about the hybrid cloud, and I think, and you may correct me, but at least 70 to 80%, if not more, of all that cloud infrastructure and talk in the cloud is happening in the hybrid cloud. What are those benefits of the hybrid cloud? Because that's where everybody is playing right now.
I think very important topic, and there seems to maybe be a couple of misconceptions. And perhaps if we start off with where IT originally came from to where it is today in terms of business value, and that is very important to understand. In the old world of IT was merely seen as a support function to most businesses.
Yes.
There's a few server systems, somebody's using a device, and you had some productivity tools in terms of perhaps applications to type out documents and so forth.
Right.
As we've gone into this digital world, businesses today, and most businesses in essence, cannot operate without technology because the fundamentals of business processes are driven through automation and systems that are paramount to keeping revenue generated, and in certain instances, key differentiators for most of these businesses. If we look at a lot of the new companies that were born off the internet, we're all familiar with the Airbnbs, the Ubers, and so forth. Those entire businesses are completely reliant on technology to operate. If the technology wasn't available, those businesses, unfortunately, would not exist today. But just looking back in terms of the benefits of hybrid cloud, if we talk about direct benefits, and this is typically where most IT departments are coming into the fore today, and the role of the CIO has completely changed, to look at taking digital technologies and adding some type of value that can differentiate the business, or even in this period that we find ourselves with the pandemic, looking at how can you change your business model to something else. As an example, face-to-face interactions are slowly becoming the thing of the past. And looking at the enabling technologies becomes a key element. Unfortunately, if you look at what we deem in the past as on-premise installations where you bought a bunch of infrastructure, you got some application vendors to install apps, and there was business value added to that. Those have slowly shifted into a lot of R&D and money that's been spent by what we call hyperscalers. So hyperscalers are your big cloud providers. At the beginning, or let's call it the beginning of this cloud journey that most customers undertook, and where the hyperscalers found themselves, they provided very basic services which slowly became commoditized. And I think they rethought their value chain or their value proposition around what can they do to add value to businesses directly. And ultimately, the focus shifted to what we call digital microservices. One example of a digital microservices is something like advanced analytics. So if you talk about digital transformation in the sense of what most businesses are looking to today, they're looking to use a data insights-driven approach, which is quite important. How do we use real-time information or different sources of information to make informed decisions? And one of the key industries in this space is retail, as we're all aware.
Yeah.
We've drastically seen the shift of retail from brick and mortar stores to online operations. And the organizations that made that shift were quite successful, specifically seen in this pandemic, where at a point you couldn't really walk into a store to buy non-essential goods. But had you shifted to the new business model, which entails things like analytics, understanding your customer behavior, and so forth, and a lot of other tools in that arena exists. And unfortunately, those tools are not easily and readily available from vendors to deploy on-premise. Customers, unfortunately, still have a lot of legacy systems and information that do exist in their data centers, and it's not easy to shift that in the cloud. However, to add that competitive edge, you need a good mix of digital tooling as well as the legacy systems. And to interconnect these two to give you immediate benefits is where I would say the value of hybrid cloud fits in, because you can use the best of both worlds, and ultimately you start accelerating your digital transformation journey without having an approach that says, let's lift and shift everything into the cloud, which could possibly take a number of months or even years in certain instances, depending on the complexities that most companies find themselves in today.
Oh, you've explained that so well, Abdul. And really, I guess what I'm hearing from you as well is that a hybrid cloud adds a lot more flexibility to your organization. But of course, you've raised such interesting points about the importance of being in the cloud. If you haven't got that on your business strategy, if you haven't started the journey, you better do that pretty soon. Otherwise, you're going to be left behind when you look at the competitors out there and the competitive advantage that the cloud and the hybrid cloud gives businesses today. Of course, one of the big things is the real cost. People say, well, there's a lot of hidden costs. It's this and there's that. I mean, what is the real cost of using the cloud in a successful way and really implementing it into your business strategy, into your business strategies that you've got? The real cost is the challenge. And that's the one question most people ask, because they say that, eventually you're going to land up spending more or not, which is not exactly true. So tell us about the cost.
I think it's one of those myth busters, and everybody's quite curious when they talk about how do we get ourselves into the cloud? Ultimately, what is our return on investment going to be? What is our total cost of ownership? And in most companies, there are set budgets. The traditional way is IT does a makeup of a budget at the beginning of each year. We've got our financial people that typically approve those budgets, and off the IT team goes in collaboration with some project teams or business initiatives to ultimately drive an outcome for that specific year. That is a traditional model, and most organizations are used to that. As you're fully aware, an FD doesn't like somebody walking into the office saying, we've got a variable budget that changes from month to month. So if we look at the cloud and what the cloud models are built on, it's built on the concept of you pay for what you consume in the cloud. So it's a pure consumption-based model, typically moving away from the traditional thinking of CapEx expenditure. and moving completely to an OpEx model. With that being said, the cloud is built to run a number of what we deem as workloads. If you think about workloads, we talk traditional and we talk modernized workloads. Traditional workloads, in the sense, are applications that were developed a couple of years ago. They use traditional static database sources. They use web services or fat clients to connect to an application. Those workloads are typically very static and they're rigid, and there's a specific infrastructure that gets designed around those workloads. And you can fairly and easily measure the cost if you're running that on premise. When we talk modernized workloads, we're talking about workloads that are natively developed for the cloud. And these are workloads that are built intelligently to leverage and understand what the consumption requirements are coming into the platform. So I'll just clarify those two a bit in terms of how the cost components come into play when you start lifting and shifting and modernizing into the cloud. So if we go back to the traditional workload sense, we've got static workloads. In the cloud, you've got a service called infrastructure as a service, which is one of the most basic service offerings. It's been around for quite a long time. It's commoditized. I think a lot of the hyperscalers typically compete on price. And in certain instances, that is the first train of thought with most IT shops. How do we lift and shift what we've got right now, put that into a place that is thought of to be self-sustainable, there's security adoption, and all the other lovely benefits that most IT shops think they're going to derive by just moving things into the cloud. With an infrastructure as a service approach in most instances, you hard provision the capacity that you actually need to run those workloads. You don't have flexibility around what we call micro consumption measurements. So you pay for the actual consumption per minute or per hour. There's a commitment either per month or per annum with these workloads, and off you go. However, there are some other costs that IT shops don't consider because there's additional service elements that's required. As an example, you might find in a traditional sense, networks are static with most customers. They pay for some bandwidth from their telco providers, and they can traverse whatever network traffic they so wish to through that connectivity that they've provisioned. Once you've moved into the cloud, that model changes because it's based on a consumption model. So in certain instances, you're paying for what's going in and out of that infrastructure. So slowly and surely, all of these things start adding up. And as you look at these additional services that you haven't thought of, you might find that your expenditure gets to a point where it's actually doubled based on what you actually budgeted for. So cost management, cost containment, and thinking about the legacy world becomes very important. If we talk about how do we effectively leverage cloud, the modernized world of cloudified applications, and we talk about technologies like Docker or containerization, which is one of the key enablers when developing cloud native applications. And the other concept is around auto-scaling. How does applications intelligently know that I need to consume more resources during specific periods on the cloud platform? And if needed, when the demand decreases, shrink to a point where either I'm not consuming any resources at all, or I'm consuming the minimum amount of resources to run these workloads. The two things are quite different, and the most cost-effective way and the way to contain costs is typically to look at how do I modernize my application to derive those benefits of actually scaling up and scaling down.
Okay, but at the end of the day, you're actually doing a lot more with less in the cloud. And there's like, the heavy duty stuff that you would have cost you a lot more to do if you had to put in the tin, as they call it, and all those applications, if you have them on, servers in your premises, etc. So the cloud offers a lot more flexibility again, and a lot more heavy lifting, as you mentioned earlier. One of the things, Abdul, is security. Security comes up over and over again. And, you know, moving stuff into the cloud, there's people have a lot of questions, and people think as well that, hey, if I put my stuff up into the cloud, it's secure. I don't have to worry too much about security. Talk to us about the importance of security and how people should view security and the cloud per se.
I think this is probably one of the most important topics today, specifically with the publication of all the cyber attacks that we've seen recently, some massive data breaches.
Yeah.
And often when I'm sitting in front of customers or even at a conference, I get challenged and I get asked the question, where is your data or your information systems the most secure? Would it be running on if you ran it on premise, or would it be more secure if you ran it in the cloud? And typically the topics of hyperscalers have invested billions of dollars in R&D and cybersecurity teams and a whole lot of other aspects to ensure that their platforms are secure. Yes, to a certain extent, and it's one of those myth busters as well. That is true in the sense of the platforms are secure. However, most organizations are under the impression that should they lift and shift, once again going back to the legacy world, should they lift and shift workloads into the cloud, that they automatically get all the security features that are built into the native platform. To a certain extent they do, but when we're going up the stack into what we call the logical layers with something like infrastructure as a service, you still have an operating system, you still have the applications that need to be maintained. So the way that the security policies are driven and the technologies to secure that essentially still comes back to the way you are running your security in your own data center. Right. So it doesn't mean that you're actually more secure in the public cloud. The question also begs around, if you have cybersecurity attacks, where would a cybersecurity breach typically happen first? Yes. And those are typically aimed at your large-scale, hyperscale infrastructure, rather than a small little data center running on its own or an island, unless it's a massive client, typically in financial services where you can get personal information. But those are targeted attacks. But widespread attacks in terms of the hyperscalers opens up the door to global cybersecurity attacks rather than targeted specific attacks. So in essence, there's still a balancing act between what you've done on premise versus what you've done in the cloud. However, we should not underestimate the microservices that are available. So should you move away from the traditional world of infrastructure as a service to the upper layers where services are delivered, such as software as a service, yes, the security is taken care of by the hyperscalers. And in those instances, you might find that you are more secure because the teams, the thought, the IP that's been driven behind that security is one that you typically wouldn't have budget for if you ran your own security shop in-house.
Right, right. Okay, I mean, these are critical things that you're talking about, and you're so right. I mean, that must be one thing that keeps you awake at night. I mean, you look at these attacks that have been happening. I mean, just in the lockdown period, it's been a very significant jump in attacks on organizations. It's very, very real, and people should take security very, very seriously. You mentioned a lot about hyperscaling, and you know, the Vmware is one organization that comes into mind quite a few times, and there are certainly lots of benefits when it comes to VMware. But when you sign into a hyperscaler, you're basically locked in. How do you get out of that particular situation?
Most definitely, and those are one of the important considerations when selecting a cloud approach or a cloud strategy. The worst thing that you'd ever want is to find yourself in a situation where you've moved everything into a provider and there's unhappiness for whatever reason and you can't get yourself out. Or it becomes extremely costly to get yourself out of those agreements, depending on the terms that you've signed and the financial implications around that, because you might have committed to a specific financial arrangement. Yeah. In the instance with VMware, what they've done successfully, and VMware, as you're fully aware, are probably one of the pioneers when it comes to software virtualization or software data center solutions, looking back in the x86 space, I'm
Yes.
talking about mainframe and other technologies, they've slowly evolved into this concept initially of how do I implement a private cloud? And as the hyperscale adoption increased, they slowly realized that they would need to interface or integrate into these hyperscalers. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, and we agreed to some extent that hybrid cloud in some form or the other is needed to derive all the benefits that we discussed. So most customers today, and probably over 70% of clients running virtualization, has adopted VMware as a technology. So it was a natural transgression to understand how does VMware allow their customers to seamlessly integrate into the hyperscaler to get those complexities or drive those complexities away with, as an example, the digital microservices can easily talk to the information systems that are running in the data center, and the two things can integrate, and you can derive those quick benefits around things like advanced analytics, IoT, etc. But what VMware strategically did over the last few years, they signed up partnerships with all the big hyperscalers to ensure that their software and the compatibility stack allows customers to seamlessly connect and integrate into these hyperscalers. And in essence, if you look at the skills and capabilities that's needed outside of what VMware has done, so if you traditionally as an IT shop went and tried to do all of the stuff, there are a lot of moving pieces. One of them, and it's quite complex, is how do you, from a network point of view, and I'm just putting it out there because these are some real technical challenges that people need to consider. How do you connect your systems from a network point of view securely between your data center into the cloud and ensure that systems can interface quite seamlessly? VMware's pioneered that as an example as part of the stack that they've developed. Their roadmap, and just maybe to give you insights, we talk about something called VMware Cloud Foundation. And VMware Cloud Foundation is a key enabler to make all these things possible in terms of a customer running VMware, leveraging the hyperscaler through a single pane of glass by provisioning services within the cloud or on-premise. So
Right.
it's all seen or looked at as a cohesive system.
Okay, no, I mean it's very interesting. So I mean there's like seamless integration. There's no reason for anyone to see the migration to the cloud as a daunting task. It's something that must be as part of any single business that's out there, and a very integral part of the success of businesses going forward. And you talk about that digital transformation, it really has to happen. And then in closing, Abdul, is there one thing that keeps you awake at night as the Chief Technology Officer of Co-Create? I'm sure security might be right there, but what's the thing that keeps you awake at night when you look at this transformation and you look at the clouds and you look at the possible things that could go wrong? What keeps you awake at night?
What keeps me awake at night is probably our capabilities to execute and the understanding around digital transformation holistically. If we think about the traditional skill sets, a lot of the, I'll call it old school IT personnel, have a certain way of thinking, and it's more around engineering and managing systems. And there seems to be a huge divide between those capabilities and what we're seeing from the new IT graduates that are predominantly focused on how do we create an application, how do we generate wealth, how do we differentiate ourselves in terms of the business world that I've spoken to. And the two things are not connecting at this point. And I think we need to find a way to bridge that skills gap between what we call the old school IT teams and the new way of thinking from a digital services point of view. If we get that correctly, I think it will also accelerate the cloud adoption approach in terms of deriving those benefits that I spoke about by using these digital microservices, including correctly leveraging the hybrid cloud.
Interesting.
So the skills in our country, as things are moving along, is a bit of a concern, especially if we talk about 4IR. and what our government sees as a key enabler to restart this economy and possibly differentiate ourselves as a country, not only on the continent, but globally by using these technologies. But the skills and capabilities, I think, are something that still needs to be looked at quite closely.
It's such an important note, and skills are critical in this particular economy. And if we have to take this digital transformation that we talk about, we need to have the right people at the helm, and the skills are just such an important part of it. And there's such a massive gap with regards to skills that we really need to upskill people and get more people involved in this particular sector. Abdul Moosa, the Chief Technology Officer of Co-Create, thank you so much for those insights. We do appreciate your time. We wish you well and every success in your businesses going forward. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Aki, and thanks for the chat. Hopefully it's informative and it provides the listeners with food for thought. And hopefully we've learned some lessons as we've gone through this cloud journey, and we can adopt the services in a way that adds true business value.
Thank you.